All right, kind enough to join us here. We alluded to him earlier, but he's the author of this fantastic book. I'm going to point to it here, but you can see it in full screen if you're watching us on YouTube. We hold these truths, how to spot the myths that are holding America back. Well, America's being held back. We're going to get into that in a second, but Dr. Casey Burgat joins us. He's also a professor at George Washington University. Casey, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the program with us.
Absolutely. Mike, Nick, great to be with you.
Yeah, you and I were talking about this off air, and about some of the teaching of civics. There's in the back of the book right here. It says the book is a crash course on the civics America needs. But does America want it? We're going to get into that in just a second. That's the first thing. Nick and I have been trying to add to the discourse and get more of that in there. But why don't you take us a little bit inside? And I'm so appreciative of your publishers reaching out to us and sending us over copies of this book, because there are a lot of things in here, and we're going to dispel some of these myths in a second, but there's a lot in your book. I'm curious as to what made you want to write it, and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah. So, long story short, is I always was in and around politics, ended up on Capitol Hill as a staffer at their research shop, then went to think tank land working on congressional and political reforms, and now at GW, kind of doing the same, where my whole professional life has been spent working on making politics, and especially federal politics, work a little bit better. And in those conversations, including with some of the most powerful people on the planet, we were having the same conversations over and over and over that just would simply not only not fix the problem, but oftentimes if they got what they wanted, it would make the problems worse. And so after years and years of just having those same misguided conversations, I just decided, let's put all these down in one resource, one book, knock it out for the American public, for folks who are even passively paying attention. You can pick this up and read it. It is accessible on purpose. It's entertaining on purpose. And I say that as a nerd academic. I know the difference. Where I just want people to be able to pick this up and recognize that, hey, maybe all these things that we're being told and think ourselves might not be the solutions we think they are.
Oftentimes when you have a collection of essays, like there are certain universal themes that emerge. When you were looking back in the text, were there any unintended themes or just commonalities that stood out to you that readers also may notice as well, that sort of give some shape to what some of the concerns are, either present or not spoken of as much as they should, about where we are as a country?
Yeah, so for context for the readers, is I went and reached out to a lot of my friends who have worked in these jobs, because I didn't want this just to be another academic saying this is what we should be doing for politics. There's plenty of that out there. I wanted this to be something different. And so I went and found practitioners, those that study this, have lived it, held the jobs, and purposefully on both sides of the aisle, so that people can't automatically pick this up and say, these are a bunch of liberals, these are a bunch of conservatives, to the point of making that maybe these are just actually things that are true, and it doesn't matter what your partisan identity is. So I went and found those people across all these chapters. And as I talked to them, one of the biggest surprises that I got was the lack of no's. The people that wanted to jump into this because, and this is the theme throughout, that they're tired of having these misguided conversations too, right? Whether it's members of Congress who served for across presidencies, or folks that worked for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, they were saying that they go back to their barbecues, their neighbors, their friends, even at the grocery store, and they're just hearing these things, and they just wish they could say, that's just actually not how it works, right? And so they were excited to be a part of a bipartisan collection of these leaders on these individual topics, and just kind of put in a flag in the ground and say, actually, we should and need to think about these things a little bit different if we ever want to have the chance of actually fixing it. To me, we can bat around solutions all day, but if we're not united around the what the problems are, then we're just wasting our time talking about solutions that aren't even talking about the problems.
So obviously, there are a multitude of items and areas to go through in the text, but if you had to think of, like, in your head, like maybe your top three or top five issues as a country we need to better understand the reality, as you mentioned about what experts are telling you, what's an example of one that just may, I think, put on the table the real issue that's going on that we're not talking about?
Yeah, and this is a perfect day to have this episode, in that the most present chapter is the one about presidential power, the myths surrounding presidential power, that we live in a day and age where the president is the be-all, end-all of our federal politics, that even senators and governors are elected on the popularity or unpopularity of certain presidential candidates. There's never been less difference in what it means to believe in a political party and what the president actually says. Right. And we see this carry out in our lawmaking. And there's a lot of myths around presidential power in that because this person is so well known, he's ubiquitous in federal politics. I mean, turn on the news, you're going to see Trump. Right. It's just how it's filtered, whether it's in Des Moines, Iowa or Miami, Florida. That's just what's going to dominate the news cycle when you're talking about politics. And that leads to people thinking, because they're told by these presidential candidates, that I can solve all your problems. All I need is your support. On day one, I will. And we saw this today with the inauguration. He's going to whip back to the White House and sign 100 executive orders in the first couple of days of administration. And what that takes away is that ain't how it's supposed to work. He is not supposed to be a policy-making authority. He can influence it. He can work with members of Congress, but we have a branch for that. And that's what Congress is supposed to be for. So the presidential power and expecting the president to do everything from lower our taxes to make inflation less harmful, to lowering gas prices, the thing that we hear them talking about in campaigns, actually just it fuels our cynicism, because they ain't going to fix it on day one. So that means you're going to say, I got promised everything from here to the moon. They broke these promises because they couldn't do it unilaterally, and now I'm pissed again. And we just see this, and right now we're at a place where actually taking advantage of that cynicism is a really good election strategy, and that's dangerous for any democracy who wants people to be involved and trust in their institutions.
You know, Casey, we were talking about this off, but I want to bring it on here first because you mentioned, and Nick asked you about the essays. It is a compilation of people that have actually been on this show as well. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, as I was mentioning to you off air, Alyssa Farah Griffin, who I happen to know from CNN Times. And I'm interested because you just talked about the presidential powers, one central theme. I want to get to another one because presidential powers, there's normally a document attached to it, right? That's like the law that was like back in the 1780s that we're still following, or at least holding and decreeing that we should be following some of those things. And Lindsay Chervinsky has actually mentioned some of those things on this show about, hey, the founders didn't plan for this. This wasn't perfect. So I want to kind of ask you, as we're piggybacking off of inauguration here, and the limits, or at least the legal limits of the Constitution have been tested a lot by this current administration that's incoming. Your chapter, or Lindsay's chapter specifically about the Constitution here, how should we hold these myths and the truths about the Constitution and what we should be talking about with respect to the Constitution and the president's authority and the three branches of government, et cetera? How do you look at it, and how does this book kind of tackle or dispelling some of the myths about the Constitution?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of my favorite sayings in politics is that two things can be true at the same time. That we're often only given a binary choice, D or R, vote yes, vote no. And that reduces the infinite possibilities down to a single choice, right, with two options. And that's just really rarely ever true in life and in politics. And so the chapter about the Constitution being perfect, Lindsay's chapter, it's titled "The Founders and Their Infinite Wisdom." And you hear that all the time. You even see members of Congress go to the floor and say, the founders didn't want us to. Like, everyone's cherry picking exactly what we think the founders wanted. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Constitution came about, where it was a very delicate time. And the document that ultimately ended up being produced was a mishmash of compromises about everything. And when they couldn't compromise, they left it out on purpose, because the alternative for them was that we didn't get a constitution at all. And this was a time where we already failed on our Articles of Confederation. We were scared that England was going to come back over with all their ships and take us back over. Like, this was a perilous time. They knew they had to get it right. And that has led us, we've glorified these founders because we should. Here's the two things can be true at the same time part. They were geniuses. They set up the most free and fair government that's ever existed, even in their own times when half of the population was disbarred with women, and certain if you weren't a white land-owning person, you weren't allowed to participate. That was still an improvement on most other democracies in the world at the time. And then they set up a system of checks and balances that has withstood the test of time longer than most democracies have existed. So they were geniuses. but they also weren't perfect, right? And they even told us that on purpose, that this was just a starting point, what our generation could put forward to hopefully, and they were hoping at this point, to last at least one more generation, to then the next people who come along as the world changes, gets bigger, more complicated, fix it, make it better, make it work for you. And they gave us an amendment structure. We've only had 27 of them ever since we adopted this thing back in 1789, 27 amendments. 2 of them have dealt with alcohol, right? Like, so we have just really ignored the path that they laid for us. So we can respect them as geniuses and still have a worthwhile debate that, hey, maybe the document that they wrote 240 years ago doesn't apply to a time where there's not electricity, let alone TikTok or the internet or a world where you can communicate and send money across with the click of a button on your phone. It's a different world, and our Constitution should reflect that. And they knew it. They let us have that opportunity, and we've kind of ignored it for most of our history.
Casey, you just made a reference to something that the founders also would not have imagined, which is this thing we call the internet. So your book, as presented, is a collection of thoughts from learned, intelligent people. Unfortunately, what seems to be mostly taking up the brain space and what we're reading and what we're sort of taking in, through our sensory inputs in our brain, often is through the form of social media, which is mostly paraded by or trafficked by folks who are not learned people and sometimes questionably intelligent. How do we get to a place where, well, knowing that that's the world we currently live in, like that's what counts for discourse now. And that's what's sort of helping to inform current elections, in many ways, the cynicism that we have toward our government, because we are practicing ignorance, when we listen to these folks. How do we, what's the corrective to it? I mean, a book like yours, yes, but is that partly what's causing the erosion of civics and our understanding of civics in this country?
I think it's a huge opportunity, right? That we've never had a better chance to reach people where they are. And that's always been the challenge of media companies and businesses and universities, recognizing where folks are and be able to talk their language and how they hear it. Social media is a flattening of this, and it comes with stuff ain't free, right? It has trade-offs, has huge negative consequences. But for me, when we're talking about the opportunity to reach folks and educate on civics, which is how the government works, not just the structure of it and who's powerful and what was the date the Stamp Act passed. Like that's what we say civics is, but that ain't it. It's how to be an active democratic citizen. And I think that social media is a huge opportunity, and that we're literally one click away from connecting to millions and millions of people. Do you know how powerful that can be in kind of creating a message of like, let's start at the fundamentals here about, does government matter? I think most people would say yes. We can disagree about what form it should take and how big it should be, fine. But does it matter? Yes. Does it rely in our system on people being informed? I think most people would say yes. If we can just start on that, then the question is, all right, how do we inform them? Our schools have got rid of civic education. Our politics and our civic organizations are getting less and less, right? Like fewer and fewer throughout the country. And so then how do we make up that deficit, knowing that we need to reach a lot of people who right now see government as something to avoid or something that is just there to take their money or make them mad? And so we need a full recommitment to civics. And I think that social media has its dangerous components, the same way that the internet was talked about having its dangerous components, the same way that TV and radio before that. It's a shakeup. It's a full-on revolution. Revolutions can come with often huge, dangerous consequences, but they can also lead to incredibly beautiful things when people get behind the right movements at the right time.
It's so funny that you say some of this because, when Nick and I started this show, it was really about adding to the discourse. I'm a former news producer at one of these networks. So it was very like, we want to do this. There's an intentionality behind it. People listen. Cool. If they don't, it's still part of, hey, you want to learn? This is a stop on the learning train. If you want to be a part of that, come aboard this stop. But this isn't your only destination. There should be others along the way. And in that vein, there's so many different topics that are discussed in this book. I just want to read some of the chapter titles for people here. Members of Congress don't do anything, by Representative Derek Kilmer. Politicians are bought and paid for, by Representative Steve Israel. You've heard for people that listen to this show or other shows on our network, Journalistically Speaking with Rick Sanchez, he's mentioned that topic. But I want to get into your chapter specifically that you wrote about term limits will fix our broken Congress. And these are things, we've had members of Congress on this show. There's the hypocrisy of Ted Cruz saying he's against term limits, and then he gets an extra term limit. So I want you first take us inside this chapter, because let's analyze what is an issue right now playing out that Nick and I cover, which is members of Congress. You start in your chapter talking about Dianne Feinstein not remembering where she is and going to a vote. Been very vocal about age limits and stuff like that with respect to members of Congress. But when we look at the 535 people that make up Congress with the Senate and the House, what is wrong with this issue, and what is something that you address in the book about fixing potentially the issues of Congress?
Yeah, so the chapter titles are in quotes, and that's on purpose because those are the how we hear everyday Americans talk about that myth specifically. And so when you mentioned the term limits chapter, the one that I wrote individually, term limits will fix our Congress. Like, this is phrased and thought of as a silver bullet to solve a lot of the things that people hate about Congress, right? Not only do you get rid of the Feinsteins and maybe the Mitch McConnells who are freezing and Nancy Pelosi who recently fell, like, we got a really old Congress. In fact, historically old Congress. Okay, so that's true. But it's also thought, term limits are also thought to fix lobbyist influence, because then they'll be out of town and not relying on lobbyists to fund their campaigns. It'll make them more comfortable to take tough votes, so they're not worried about their next election. It's like seen as like this really panacea of fixing things. And the hard part to tell people, I get it, right? It's one of the most popular reform ideas out there. Plus 90% of the American people say, yes, absolutely, this makes total sense. Get these guys out of here. The problem is that we have a lot of experience with term limits at the state level and in other countries. And this is one of the ones where it wouldn't fix your problems. It would make all of them worse. So let's deal with the age issue first, because that's what people mostly think about when you think about term limits, Feinstein's and others, right? Chuck Grassley's in his 90s right now. Term limits, if you have a problem with age, then you want age limits. That's a different thing than term limits, right? Term limits kick people out after they've served a certain number of years in Congress, right? Usually it's 6 years or 8 years in the House, and then 2 terms in the Senate. That's the most commonly put forward reform idea with term limits. You are kicking everyone out after those term limits, whether they're 35 or 95, like Chuck Grassley, irrespective, without thinking about if their constituents want them back, if they're incredibly effective at the job, if they are seen as some of the best working people in Washington, D.C., and there are some of those out there. You're just kicking them out no matter what. And they're going to have to be replaced. So if you're thinking it's going to solve the polarization problem, it won't. It'll make it worse, because the people that you're going to have to refill those seats much, much faster than you do right now when people run for more election cycles. And with the number of competitive elections we have right now, again, at a historically small level, that means you got to win all those elections in the primary, where we know the most extreme voters take place. So you're replacing a lot of would-be more compromising or bipartisan lawmakers. Like, look at Joe Manchin. If he was term limited, he was the only person in West Virginia that could be a Democrat and represent that state. When he finally said that he was going to retire, or he retired because he knew he was going to lose, that's because he's going to lose to an incredibly extreme Republican who is now sitting in his seat in the Senate. So when you force these people out, they're going to be replaced by more extreme lawmakers, unless we fix the election side. They would actually make them more dependent on lobbyists, not less, because just like when you start any job, you go find someone who knows how to do it. First, you probably ask Google, right? And then when that doesn't help you, you go find someone that's been there a while and has kind of taken their lumps, and you say, hey, how do we actually do this? That's what members of Congress do too. And sometimes they ask their colleagues, but if their colleagues are just about ready to be term limited out, they're all fresh too. So they're going to go ask people who have been in DC for a long time, and that's where the lobbyists come in. Makes them more dependent on campaign donors. It makes them more partisan. It makes them more dependent on the presidency and the executive branch officials. So all the things that you think term limits are doing, they're only going to make them worse, while doing nothing to satisfy the diversity problem that we have in Congress. Diversity is a major problem, not only age, but income levels, race, religion, any demographic variable you can think of. It doesn't make it more diverse. What you'll do is you'll just create an environment where people who run for Congress and serve in Congress can afford to do it. only for 6 years, 8 years, maybe, right? Like, can you just take a 6-year or 8-year break from your job as like a, let's go play in Congress for a while, then go back and be a plumber? That ain't how it works. There's not enough people to do that. You'll make it older, you'll make it richer, you'll make it whiter, all in the effort of saying, let's maximize diversity here.
So coming out of reading your book, Casey, what advice do you have for others? Like, how do people continue their learning, become more engaged, become a more engaged citizen? What is the next step other than the required reading, which is this great book that you're putting out?
Yeah, it's not, you got to memorize it. It's not enough to read it. No, I'm just kidding. There's a lot we can do, right? Like, to say that I am helpless in this, the best thing I can say for folks is to get involved. And get involved doesn't mean vote. Like, that's the cheapest, easiest way to be a citizen, is just vote. But almost all of governing happens between the elections. If you've never been to a city council meeting, go. Even if you like wrestling, and if you think Congress is wild, go to a city council meeting. That will knock your socks off in terms of what they talk about and how they talk about it. And the irony is that you can make such a greater impact at the local level, even state level, than you ever could at the federal level. Yet we still spend 99% of our attention focusing on politics. So my number one message is, do not treat politics like a hobby. It's not meant to entertain you. It's meant to inform you and to make your lives better. And if you're just shouting from the sidelines, get involved, join a book club, go to a library, attend a Rotary meeting. You'll be really inspired by the folks who show up and the impact you can have just by collecting a couple signatures, putting a proposal in front of a school board or a city council. Start local, show up to those meetings, and you'd be surprised at just how much impact you can have in a business where it often feels like your vote doesn't even matter, let alone you showing up.
Parks and Rec is not heightened what happened there in Pawnee, Indiana. It's not heightened. You know, it's funny that you say that. And I want to ask you this because it funnels in perfectly. But as Nick and I have started this show and we've gone to more, Nick and I have been to the third party candidate debates between the Libertarian candidate and Green Party candidate. And we've gone to some local events that you were just mentioning in terms of here in Miami as well, city council meetings that, you know, Billy Corbin has well documented. And they're interesting to watch, right? Local politics, and all politics is local, as they say. But if somebody right now, there's a local bookstore right near my house over here, and if somebody happens to see this book on the counter, we like to ask authors this question. So I would love to get your take on this, Kathy, right? So you happen to be in the bookstore, they pick up the book, they're looking at it, you're over their shoulder, you're whispering in their ear, not sweet nothings, but you're telling them about the book. What are you saying to them about why they should buy this book?
That this is we're in a tough spot democratically, and history has shown that it can go a bunch of different ways, right? And so I'm telling them, like, if you feel like you have a duty to play to this country, even if it's just this big, check it out. Make sure you're thinking about things the right way, that you don't have to be the one out there waving a flag or raising $1 million, even running for office yourself, but you can and must do your part. And that takes a fundamental understanding about how politics works, why it's important, and how so often that people get into power by taking advantage of our cynicism, right? It's such a good message to say, you're pissed, I get it, I'll fix it, you won't be pissed anymore. That's an easy, tried and true way to even being president of the United States now. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. There has been generations before us who have rejected the cynicism after falling for it for a while. Now it's our time. Now it's our time. Government ain't going anywhere. If you're not paying attention, if you're not being a part of it, someone is more than happy to be your voice. Take your voice and make it theirs. Don't let them. We have to be a part of this together, and our small parts together make up all the difference in the world.
Dr. Casey Burgat, I got to tell you, professor over at George Washington University out in Washington, D.C. Your students are lucky, man. We hold these truths, how to spot the myths that are holding America back. Go get that book wherever books are sold. I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program with us, giving us a couple minutes here. We'd love to have you back on anytime. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
I appreciate you guys. Thanks for reading. Thanks for the time. Thanks for the message.